What you find when you stop looking. Part 1. The student who came to say goodbye. Jacob Reeves came to the dojo on a Thursday afternoon in the spring of 1985. He was 17 years old. He had been training at the school since he was 8, which meant 9 years, which was longer than many adults stayed with any practice, which was long enough to have become not a student in the temporary sense, but a practitioner in the permanent one. He had the quality that long practice produces, the specific way of moving through space that comes from years of forms and sparring, the attention to environment that becomes automatic after enough time in rooms where attention determines outcome, the particular self-possession that the practice builds when it's working. Chuck was in the office when Jacob arrived. He saw him through the window, the boy walking across the parking lot with the deliberate pace of someone who has come for a specific purpose and is managing the approach. Chuck knew, before Jacob came through the door, that this was not an ordinary visit. Jacob knocked on the office doorframe even though the door was open. This was his manner, formal in the ways that mattered, casual in the ways that didn't. Chuck had always appreciated this about him. "Come in," Chuck said. Jacob came in and sat in the chair across from the desk without being asked. This too was his manner. He had been in this office enough times over 9 years to know that the formality of permission was not required for the sitting. "I need to tell you something," Jacob said. Chuck looked at him, the quality of Jacob's voice, level, deliberate, carrying the specific weight of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say, told him what the something was before Jacob said it. "Stanford accepted me," Jacob said. "Early admission. I'm going in the fall." Chuck nodded. "Congratulations," he said, and meant it. The congratulation was genuine. The recognition of achievement was real. Stanford was not an easy acceptance. Jacob had earned it through the same quality of sustained work he had brought to the practice. "Thank you," Jacob said. He was quiet for a moment. "I won't be able to train there, not at this level. They have a martial arts club, but it's not." He stopped. "It's not this." "No," Chuck said. "It won't be this." Jacob looked at his hands. "I've been training here since I was 8 years old," he said. "That's more than half my life. And I'm about to go somewhere where that won't be the thing anymore, where the dojo won't be the place I come back to." "Yes," Chuck said. "I wanted to." Jacob started again. "I wanted to come here before I left and understand what I'm taking with me. Not the techniques. I'll remember the techniques, but the other thing, the thing underneath." He looked at Chuck. "What did the practice actually give me?" Chuck looked at him for a long moment. The question was the kind that serious students asked when they were at a transition point, leaving for college, starting a career, getting married, the specific moments when life required you to assess what you had built and what you were carrying forward. Chuck had heard versions of it many times over the years. He had given various answers, depending on the student and the moment and what seemed useful at the time. This time, with Jacob Reeves at 17 after 9 years of genuine practice, he wanted to give the true answer, not the pedagogical one, the true one. "I'll tell you," Chuck said, "but first I want you to tell me something." "What? Why did you keep coming?" Chuck said. "Not at the beginning. Your father brought you, that's why you started. But after the first year, after the second year, why did you keep showing up? Why did you keep showing up?" Part 2. What Jacob said. Jacob thought about this with the seriousness that real questions deserved. He did not rush the answer. He sat in the chair across from Chuck's desk and looked at the window and thought. "At first," he said, "I kept coming because my father wanted me to. That was the first year, maybe the second. It was the thing I did on Tuesday and Thursday because that's what we had decided I would do." "When did it change?" Chuck said. "Third year," Jacob said. "There was a moment, I don't remember what triggered it, probably nothing dramatic, when I realized I was thinking about the practice when I wasn't here. Not obsessively, but it was present, like he searched for the word, like background music that you don't notice until it stops, except I was noticing it while it was playing. What were you thinking about it? The forms, Jacob said. Whether I was doing them correctly. Whether the thing you had corrected in Tuesday's class had stuck, or whether I was still making the same mistake. Whether the quality of my attention during the warm-ups was the same quality I brought to the actual techniques. He paused. I was thinking about whether I was improving, and the thinking about it meant I cared about it, and the caring about it meant it wasn't just a thing my father wanted me to do anymore. It was a thing I was doing. Chuck nodded. When did you know you were going to stay? 5th year, Jacob said immediately. There was a class intermediate session, 20 people. You were teaching the second form from the advanced sequence even though we weren't ready for it yet. You said something I've never forgotten. What did I say? You said, the form is not preparation for something else. The form is the thing itself. Jacob looked at Chuck. I didn't understand it completely when you said it, but I understood enough that the practice wasn't training for a future moment when I would use it. The practice was the use, and that changed everything. Chuck was quiet. He remembered the class Jacob was describing. He remembered the session, the form, the specific quality of the room when he had said that sentence. He did not remember that Jacob had been the one to hear it most clearly. But that was always the case with teaching. You said things into the room, and you didn't always know who received them or how. So you stayed, Chuck said, because you understood that the practice was the thing you were doing, not preparation for a thing you would do later. Yes, Jacob said, and because he stopped. Say it, Chuck said. Because I was better at it than I was at most other things, Jacob said. Not better in the competitive sense. Better in the sense that when I was doing it, I was more genuinely myself than I was in most other situations. There was less. He searched again. Less distance between what I was doing and who I was. Chuck looked at him. Jacob Reeves at 17 had just given the most accurate description of what the practice was for that Chuck had heard from a student in 15 years. That's what the practice gave you, Chuck said. Omum Thalenta. Part 3. The honest account. The practice, Chuck said, gives you access to a version of yourself that is less managed than the version you present most of the time. Jacob was listening with the full quality of his attention. Most of the time, Chuck continued, you're managing how you appear, managing what people think, managing the gap between your internal state and your external presentation. This is not bad. It's necessary. We all do it. But it's exhausting in a way we don't usually notice because we're always doing it. Yes, Jacob said. The practice, Chuck said, is one of the few places where the management stops being useful. In the dojo, in the form, in the sparring, you can't manage your way through it. The technique either works or it doesn't. The balance is either there or it isn't. The attention is either present or it's wandering. The practice doesn't care what you look like from the outside. It only responds to what you actually are in the moment. Jacob nodded slowly. And when you spend enough time in a space where management doesn't work, Chuck said, you start to develop a different relationship with yourself. You started to notice the gap between what you are and what you're performing, and you start to close it. Not perfectly. Nobody closes it perfectly, but closer. Is that what you meant, Jacob said, when you said the delay gets smaller? Yes, Chuck said. He had not remembered that he had said that to Jacob or to Jacob's father years earlier, but the sentence was accurate and Jacob's memory of it was accurate. The delay between stimulus and response, the delay between what you actually want and what you say you want, the delay between your internal state and your external presentation. The practice, when it's working, makes the delays smaller, and that's what I'm taking with me, Jacob said, to Stanford, to wherever I go after that. Yes, Chuck said, the techniques will fade if you don't practice them. The forms will get fuzzy in your memory after a few years without repetition. But the thing underneath, the capacity to be present, to close the gap, to operate with less delay, that stays because you've built it into your nervous system. It's not knowledge, it's capacity. Jacob was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Always." "Did you know that's what you were building?" Jacob said. "When you started the school, when you started teaching, did you know that the thing underneath the techniques was what you were actually giving people?" Part 4. What Chuck hadn't known. Chuck thought about this question. He thought about 1963, when he had opened the school in Torrance in the former laundromat, with the sleeping bag and the industrial detergent smell still in the walls. He thought about what he had believed he was doing at that time, teaching martial arts, building a student base, creating a livelihood, earning respect in the community. He thought about what he had discovered over the subsequent 22 years of doing the thing he had believed he was doing. That the techniques were the form, and that what the form was teaching was something that lived underneath the techniques. That the practice was giving students access to a version of themselves that was less managed and more present. That the real curriculum was not the strikes and the blocks, but the capacity to close the gap between what you are and what you perform. "No," Chuck said. "I didn't know that's what I was building." Jacob looked at him. "When I started," Chuck said, "I thought I was teaching karate. The techniques, the forms, the applications. I thought that's what the teaching was, transmitting the technical knowledge I had accumulated through the practice and the competition." He paused. "I discovered over time that the technical knowledge was the vehicle. What I was actually transmitting was something else. The thing you just described, the capacity to be present, to operate with less delay, to close the gap. When did you realize that?" Jacob said. "Gradually," Chuck said. "There wasn't a single moment. It was more like he thought about how to say it, more like a series of recognitions. Individual students who came back years later and told me what they had taken from the practice. And what they described wasn't the techniques. It was the thing underneath, like my father," Jacob said. "Yes," Chuck said, "like your father. He came back after 9 years and told me that the practice had given him something he couldn't quite name. A reduction in the delay. That was how he described it. And I recognized what he was describing because I had felt it myself. But I hadn't had a clear way to articulate it until he said it." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "So you've been teaching something," he said, "that you didn't fully understand you were teaching until students told you what they had learned." "Yes," Chuck said, "that's exactly right." "That seems..." Jacob stopped. "Uncertain," Chuck said. "Yes, it is uncertain," Chuck said. "But that's the nature of this kind of teaching. You can't teach presence directly. You can only create the conditions where presence becomes possible, and then the student either develops it or they don't. And sometimes they develop it without you fully understanding what you've helped them develop." He paused. "The practice," Chuck said, "is larger than any practitioner, including the teacher. I've been in it for 25 years, and I'm still discovering what it does, what it's for, what it gives." Reeves, Part 5. The question Jacob asked back. Jacob looked at Chuck for a long moment. Then he said, "Can I ask you the same question you asked me?" "Go ahead." "Why do you keep coming?" Jacob said. "You've been doing this for 25 years. You were the world champion. You've taught hundreds of students. You've built the thing you set out to build. Why do you still show up at 5 o'clock every morning?" Chuck looked at him. The question was direct in the way that Jacob's questions were always direct, not aggressive, not challenging, simply asking for the true information without the protective softening that most people applied to questions about motivation. "Because I don't know what else to do," Chuck said. Jacob blinked. "I don't mean that in the lost sense," Chuck clarified. "I mean it in the sense that the practice has become the organizing principle of my life. Everything else, the teaching, the films, the family, the obligations, those are things I do in the intervals between the practice. The practice is the constant. The practice is what I return to when everything else becomes unclear. And you're still finding things in it, Jacob said. After 25 years? Yes, Chuck said. Every time I run the forms, I find something I hadn't noticed before. Not always. Most mornings, the forms are just the forms, executed correctly with attention, but without revelation. But often enough, once a week, once a month, whenever the conditions are right, I find something, a detail I'd overlooked, a connection between two movements I hadn't seen, a quality of attention I hadn't been able to access before. What's the most recent thing you found? Jacob said. Chuck thought. Last week, he said, running the third form. There's a sequence near the end, the turn and strike combination, that I've been doing for 20 years. Last week, I realized I'd been doing it with a slight tension in my left shoulder, a holding that I'd never noticed because it was so small and so constant. And when I released the tension, the whole sequence changed. Not dramatically, subtly, but the change was real. After 20 years, Jacob said, you're still finding things you were doing wrong. Not wrong, Chuck said. Incomplete. There's a difference. The technique was correct. What was incomplete was my awareness of what the technique required, and the incompleteness wasn't visible until I was ready to see it. Jacob was quiet. The practice, Chuck said, never stops teaching. If you stay in it long enough, if you remain open to what it's showing you, that's why I keep coming, because I'm not done learning what it has to teach. Port 6. What stays and what goes. They sat in the office for a while after that. The afternoon light through the window had changed, later, horizontal, the specific quality of spring in Southern California, when the days were lengthening and the angle of the sun was shifting toward summer. I'm going to miss this, Jacob said finally. The dojo, Chuck said. The room, Jacob said. The quality of being in it. The specific feeling of walking onto the floor at the beginning of class and knowing that for the next hour, the only thing that matters is what happens in that hour. That feeling, Chuck said, is not located in the room. It's located in the practice, and the practice is portable. You can take it to Stanford. You can take it wherever you go after Stanford. The room makes it easier to access because the room is purpose-built for it. But the feeling itself, the feeling of being fully present to what you're doing, that's something you've developed, and it's yours. Jacob looked at him. How do I keep it? Without the room, without the regular practice, without you correcting me when I drift. You come back to it, Chuck said, the same way you came back to the forms when you were learning them, the same way you came back to your attention when it wandered during class. You notice when you've drifted, you correct, you come back. He paused. The practice doesn't require a dojo. The practice requires your decision to practice. That decision can happen anywhere, even at Stanford. Even at Stanford. Jacob was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Will you tell me one more thing?" "Yes." "What do you think I should remember?" Jacob said. "If I could only remember one thing from 9 years of training here, what should it be?" Chuck thought about this. He thought about the hundreds of things Jacob had learned over 9 years, the techniques, the forms, the sparring strategies, the competition preparation, all the specific and detailed knowledge that constituted a martial arts education. He thought about which of those things was the most essential, which one contained all the others. "The thing you said earlier," Chuck said, "about the distance between what you're doing and who you are. Remember that the practice taught you to close that distance, and remember that you can keep closing it for the rest of your life, in everything you do, not just in martial arts, in all of it." Jacob nodded slowly. "The techniques will fade," Chuck said. "The forms will get fuzzy. The specific details of what we did in this room will become memory rather than capacity. But the thing underneath, the capacity to be present, to operate with integrity, to close the gap between what you are and what you perform, that's what you keep. That's what the practice built in you. And it's permanent if you choose to keep using it." Mothanengtnar bidemul a eli olu ok. 5 o'clock. Jacob left the dojo at 5:30. Chuck watched him walk across the parking lot to his car, the same deliberate pace he had arrived with, but with a different quality now. Not lighter, not heavier, different. The quality of someone who has said goodbye to something and is carrying it forward at the same time. The next morning, Chuck arrived at the dojo at 10 minutes to 5. He changed in the back. He walked out onto the floor alone. He ran through the first form, the form he had been practicing since 1963, modified and expanded and refined over 25 years, but still recognizably continuous with what Park Sung-jin had given him at Osan Air Base. The form took 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, he thought about Jacob's question, "Why do you keep coming?" And he thought about his answer, "Because I don't know what else to do." And he thought about what he had meant by that, which was not that he was lost, but that he had found the thing, and the finding of it had organized his life in such a way that not doing it was no longer a coherent option. The practice was not what he did when he had time. The practice was the thing around which time organized itself. He thought about what Jacob had asked him to remember, and he thought about what he would have said if Jacob had asked him a different question. "What have you found?" The answer was, "I found what I was looking for before I knew I was looking for it." The answer was, "I found a way of being in the world that requires less management and more presence." The answer was, "I found something that gets deeper the longer you stay in it rather than shallower." The answer was, "I'm still finding it." Every day, every form, every moment of genuine attention to what the practice is showing me. The form ended. He stood in the silence of the empty room. In 3 hours, the first students would arrive. The work would begin. The teaching, the correcting, the watching, the specific and detailed transmission of technical knowledge that was also the transmission of the thing underneath the technical knowledge. But right now, at 5:11 in the morning, alone on the floor of the Torrance dojo, Chuck Norris was not a teacher or a champion or a film actor or a name or a person with a history or a legacy or a reputation. He was a practitioner running a form. This was the clearest version of who he had become. And he would keep becoming it every morning at 5 o'clock, for as long as the becoming was available to him. The journey had no destination. That was the whole point.